Hello. Yay. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. It's fantastic to see so many people, fantastic to see so many people on brand and wearing the T-shirts and all the stall holders here. It's great to be here today to have a chat about affirmative consent. So I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians on whose land we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people disproportionately experience sexual violence, gender-based violence, and we've got a way to go to addressing this. So I'd like to thank UC for having us here and for giving us the space to host this event today. And I'd like again to thank everyone for coming here and for your openness to having this really important conversation. I recognise that at times these conversations can be really challenging. I recognise that there may be people who have lived experience of sexual violence in the room today, and if any conversations get triggering or anything, please feel free to move around or leave or whatever. In any way we can make this a productive conversation for everyone here. So I guess just by a little way of introduction, my name's Marisa Paterson. I'm now have the incredible opportunity of being the Minister for the Prevention of Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, and also Minister for Women. And it's like a huge career highlight to be in this position today. And I guess to give you a bit of background and understanding of why I'm passionate about this, I guess drawing from my range of life experiences myself, I feel very strongly about the need for affirmative consent laws, which is why when I first was elected as a member into the Legislative Assembly, it was literally one of the first things that I went to my caucus colleagues and said, I really want to pursue affirmative consent legislation. This was all around the time of the SAPRA work. The ACT government did a huge amount of work on with community sector and with everyone who touches on sexual violence to look at how we can respond to sexual violence better. And one of my work around affirmative consent formed part of that broader work. And it took a couple of years to develop the legislation and then get it through the Assembly, but my first bill to pass the Assembly was affirmative consent legislation. So it is an absolute honour to be now 2 years on from that and to be supporting this work around the affirmative consent campaign that's been rolled out, that we've all got the T-shirts on and that we've all hopefully seen out and about and around the universities and in pubs and clubs and venues all across ACT and online. It's great to be here to sort of continue that discussion, and I'd like to introduce our amazing panellists here today. So these are people who work in this space who have bring just an incredible wealth of knowledge to the discussion around sexual violence, around consent, and who have, bring a lot of experiences through their work to this conversation. So our panellists today are Tiffany Karlsson. So she is the CEO of Canberra Rape Crisis Service. So Tiffany worked with the campaign team throughout the development along with other key stakeholders. And in particular, the input of CRCC has been really valuable to make sure that we were making sure the scenarios were real and applicable to sort of real life situations. We have Dr. Fraser, the CEO of Agenda. So Vic has been available through and contributing to the development of the campaign and there to talk about issues specific to gender diverse audiences. And we have Josh Hewitt, the manager at Everyman Australia in Canberra. So Josh is a community services leader with a unique blend of frontline experience and strategic leadership in his job with Everyman. So he coordinates teams to deliver trauma-informed, evidence-based support to men with high and complex needs. So we thought we'd sort of present this discussion today through a few themes. And the first key theme was around legitimacy and understanding why affirmative consent is so important. So based on the research undertaken for this campaign, we understood that people question the purpose and benefit of affirmative consent model. So there's sort of a cognitive loop that we heard out loud and clear through the research of, will this benefit me, my partner, society? Like, how will this benefit me? And we know, we learnt that effectively to get the message out about affirmative consent and to see change, that we must frame this not as a legal burden, but as enhancing safety, enhancing communication, and obviously enhancing sexual relationships. So I'll start by some questions. So Tiffany, I guess the first question, why do you think some people struggle to see the benefit of affirmative consent in their own lives? And what sort of role do you think community education plays?
Thank you, Minister, and also thank you for all of your leadership in this sexual violence space over a number of years. All of us in the sector really appreciate it, so thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and also acknowledge all victim survivors who have been impacted by sexual violence, and I'd like to acknowledge everyone here who's working in the sector to support our victim survivors as well. So people can really struggle to see the benefit of affirmative consent laws. I know it sounds crazy, but it is actually true that people can really struggle with that, and it's for a range of reasons. So people might consider, well, I will never assault anyone, or I know what affirmative consent laws look like, so how is this applicable to me? Some people might believe that asking for consent will be awkward, or they might fear embarrassment or rejection, because it is quite a vulnerable thing that people are doing when they're asking for consent. Some people might misunderstand what consent is. They might see it as something overly legalistic, when in fact it can be really simple. Privilege or lack of experience can also really play a part here. If someone has not ever been in a position where they are fearful, where they have lost control, they might not see that it is a thing that is relevant to them in terms of their own personal experience. And some people might just not know how to ask for or give consent, when really it doesn't need to be complicated at all. So at CRCC, we receive hundreds of calls each month supporting people who have been affected by sexual violence. And so education campaigns like this are really one of the most important tools we have to stop violence before it starts. And conversations like the ones we're having right here today really help normalise consent and the benefits of it. And the benefits are really huge. So they include better communication, less harm, more confidence, and better sex. And then in terms of what role community education plays, like, we clearly need cultural change when it comes to sexual violence, because the statistics are horrifying and they're increasing all the time. So some of us were at the 2025 Women's Health Survey, Health Matters survey yesterday. And one of the really alarming statistics in that was that almost 2 in 5 ACT women who responded have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. That is a horrifying figure. The ABS figures show that 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. And we know that a very small number of survivors report to the police, so the true numbers are much higher. So in relation to bridging that gap between the amazing laws that we bring into place, education can really help translate for people what those laws mean into their personal relevance. So this education campaign can really start the conversation. It can continue the conversation that we're having around consent, and the work that many of us do in terms of respectful relationship education, consent education, training can really help more parts of the Canberra community to understand the relevance for them in terms of why consent is important for everyone.
Thanks, Tiff. Vic, so do know trans and gender diverse people experience sexual violence at higher rates, and I think probably, as Tiff demonstrated, we probably don't have really good numbers or data on the impact of sexual violence on that community. So I was interested in your thoughts about what are the cultural drivers for this and how can we work to embed conversations about consent within these communities?
Yeah, thanks, Minister. Interestingly, just recently, the very first national survey of sexual violence in LGBTIQ communities was released, and it was really alarming, the rate of sexual violence, particularly in transgender, diverse and intersex communities, and individuals who responded to that. In terms of the drivers, it is actually quite a complex issue, I think. Part of it is around stigma and shame, and we don't talk about trans lives enough in our community. And when we don't talk about our lives, when we don't talk about our relationships, when we don't talk about our sex lives, how do we then talk about protecting ourselves and consent and what that should look like and what pleasure in our relationships and our lives looks like? So I think that's the first driver. The second driver is, unfortunately, we're in a sort of cultural climate where our lives are fetishized in a really bizarrely negative way. And people seem to feel like they own our lives and they own our bodies. So when we're being talked about, the number of times people say things like, oh, well, tell me what you've got. What bits and pieces do you have? As if that's an okay question to ask anybody, So that also sets up an expectation that this is just normal. This is a normalised behaviour for our communities. So when that happens and we go, oh, this is really icky and I don't like this, we actually have a level of fear that goes with that. If we turn around and say, hey, no, that's not okay to ask, what are we going to be met with? The Zoe Bell Collective in Victoria did some really amazing work about trans women who are in relationship with cisgendered men. And one of the things that they spoke about in that is that in those relationships, sometimes this consent becomes a really tricky issue because the women don't know what will happen if they say no. This study, the sexual violence study that was released earlier this year, demonstrated that for our communities, the majority of sexual violence occurs from people that we know and people that we rely on. So the fear of saying no to someone who might be our ride to the doctor for our gender-affirming healthcare, who might be the person that controls our access to our children, who might be the person that puts a roof over our head. This becomes really complex. So I think, some of these drivers are absolutely around the conversations we have and our willingness to speak about our right to our bodies, our right to our lives. I do want to speak a little bit about the intersex community or intersex individuals here as well, because a growing proportion of literature is showing that sexual violence is even higher in those communities. And when we're talking about, forced medical interventions for these young people that are then accompanied with, but don't talk about your body parts to anybody else, what we're doing is we're actually setting up our young people to not be able to consent to sexual behaviours that they don't feel good about. So we really need to think about how is it that we talk about bodies? Do we talk about bodies in a way that actually emphasises pleasure and enjoyment? And do we also normalise the idea that actually not finding sexual activity pleasurable or enjoyable is okay as well,
Thank you, Vic. Lots to unpack there. Josh, so in terms of men and understanding the benefits of affirmative consent, we've had some, through the campaign that we've run, the responses on social media, for example, by some men have been quite challenging. They have clearly felt challenged by the campaign. We also have been putting up these posters in bathrooms across the territory, and the number of male bathrooms where the posters have been ripped down and have to be replaced has been really significant. So this is a good thing because it's obviously challenging people, this campaign, but what are the ways we can continue to challenge men and get ensure that they understand the benefits of consent to them as well.
Thank you. So this is a space that I work in daily. So we have men coming into our service, and we ask for a level of accountability when they come in to this space, but obviously that's not always there, or it's there for a particular reason. And I think the challenge is really important, and I think how do we reframe this from being something that's restrictive to actually something that's really empowering for men? We need to call men into this conversation rather than, I think if we call them out, we're just going to keep staying in exactly the same space that we've been in for a long, long time. So how do we call men in to what is a really, really challenging conversation? And the benefits completely outweigh anything else. Like at the end of the day, clearer signals. We know what's going on. There's a clear set of expectations, and we all want better sex. Like, we all want better sex. And so at the end of the day, if the expectations are completely clear and everyone knows exactly where we're at, well, everyone wins. I think we reduce misunderstandings and we reduce the likelihood of moving into those grey areas. We talk a lot about sexual respect and sexual disrespect. And consent leads right into sexual respect because we have empathy, we empower each other, we're respectful. And I get that this is uncomfortable, but actually we have to sit with the discomfort. As men, we have to sit with the discomfort. And at the end of the day, would you really want to do something with someone who didn't want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess to follow on from that, Josh, so what strategies do you think that we can implement that will take this a next step further?
Well,
Yep.
yeah. Look, I think this is probably the hardest part because it actually is about men starting to have an emotional literacy. Mm-hmm. We have to be able to communicate, and it's the thing that we're not great at. We need to recognise our feelings, and we need to recognise those feelings in our partner or in the person that we're with, and then respond to that in a really respectful way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is super difficult for blokes, and there is nothing easy about this conversation, but we have to keep having it.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess back to your point, Vic, about how these challenging conversations and they need to be had early and we've got Shiftpack here who does amazing education in schools around consent and respectful relationships. But how do we start to, is curriculum education enough, or how do we start to broach some of these complexities that you were talking about?
I think it's a really interesting thing, and this is something that strikes me. Often when we talk about consent in terms of sex, we forget that we actually talk about consent every day in all sorts of different ways. We talk about consent, I've got a 12-year-old boy, and from the earliest memories that I have, we talk about consent in terms of, is it okay if we do this? Is it okay, no, you don't have to share your toy if you don't want to. You don't have to let somebody do that to you. You don't have to go and hug your mum if you don't want to. We talk about enthusiastic consent, all the time with our children. And yet somehow talking about consent around sex gets hard. And it doesn't have to. We just need to continue that conversation. We need to continue having these things. I used to be a teacher, and one of the things that I remember happening all the time, kids will get into some rough play or whatever in the classroom. I say, hang on, did you get consent for that? And it was always done with a little bit of a, smile or whatever, and the kid would be like, oh, no, I didn't. Hang on. Is it okay if I punch you in the face? No, actually, I don't want you to. Okay,
Yes.
But it's about building those conversations into our everyday activities, and then suddenly when we're saying, actually, when we're getting intimate with someone, just check if they like what you're doing. it's suddenly not hard anymore, you know. But I think, you know, to your point, Josh, I think one of the things that comes up often is around these gendered roles and around, you know, oh, if I'm to be properly masculine, then I need to not communicate what I want. You know, men can actually give and, you know, not give consent, you know, and that's actually really important as well. Too often I sort of engage with young masc people who sort of go, oh, well, I didn't realise that I could say no. Of course you can say no. It doesn't make you any less masculine to say no, you know, so that's all, yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly right, and that's, you know, embedded in the legislation. It is about communication, and I guess, Tiff, some of the criticisms and pushback around the affirmative consent legislation is that this is transactional, like you need to get permission, and so I guess how do we sort of shift that narrative that this is a natural thing rather than a transactional one?
Absolutely, and it's a really great question because this education campaign has come off the back of legislative reform. So obviously we're in that world of, if we're not doing these things, there are legal ramifications. So how do we take something that is a legal obligation and make it natural? So there are a few things we can do to take it away from that kind of, this is a checklist, or this is a contract, or I'm going to get in trouble if I don't do this thing. So I think there are a few helpful things we can do. And in my mind, the first is that we reframe consent as a connection and not compliance. So consent is about trust, it's about respect in the relationship, and that's whether it's a brief hookup or a really long-term relationship, it still applies. Second, we can look at, you know, the most important bit. It's about intimacy and it's about enjoyment of sex. And that's what sex should be about. And so consent really creates that environment where both partners can feel safe and freely express themselves, and it leads to more enjoyment for both of the people concerned. So I really want us to focus on, let's reframe it. And third, I think it becomes more natural as well if we shift that focus, and it goes back to some of the gender norms that we've been talking about as well. So we shift it from that one-sided asking for permission and chasing, and turn it into a two-sided conversation. It's a checking in with each other. It becomes reciprocal, which it should always be. And days like today really help shift that narrative. So it just takes the reframing of how we think about these affirmative consent laws to really go, yeah, it is natural. It should never be transactional. So let's change the way we're talking about it and thinking about it. So we have spoken about kids and, you know, how they have pretty good education in schools, but we know that, you know, as you get older, lots of life experience, the understanding of consent has changed over the decades. I guess, how do we deal with different generations and different age groups and their understanding of consent? And one of the things that really disturbed me very much when I was developing the legislation and doing the community consultation on it was just how explicit people were in saying, well, consent doesn't apply in a marriage, and that's very horrifying. But I guess when you've got relationships where people have behaved in certain ways and that behaviour is inbuilt over decades potentially, how do we look to engage different sort of age groups and cohorts with discussions around consent and start to break down those barriers? I think it just all comes back to appropriate communications and to be having the conversations in all the contexts, whether it's at home, it's in school. We're really lucky to have a lot of different providers in the ACT in terms of consent education. And so for me, it just comes back to that continual conversation so that it isn't something that is strange or scary. It's just part of our days. We're just talking about it, whatever age we are, in age-appropriate language to convey whatever it is we're talking about in that consent conversation.
And Josh, in the work that you do you see different responses or understandings or engagement with the consent conversation in different ages of men that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think important to acknowledge that for older generations of men, they've grown up with with this kind of idea of implied consent, that I got it at the start, and therefore I don't need to ask again. I don't need this to be an ongoing conversation. But I think this is a really dangerous territory to sit in. You know, and as is those kind of gendered norms of men always wanting sex, of this kind of persistence, and so I think about how do we actually shift that? How do we take that somewhere else? And I think for the work that we do, it's about turning the idea of strength, that being about something that's actually about respect and accountability, and that ignoring no actually damages trust in a relationship, doesn't make the relationship better. And I think also acknowledging that this is not easy, that actually men are going to be vulnerable when we start to have these conversations, because these are conversations that we're not used to having. And now we're in a position actually where we have to start having them, because we know that we are a big part of the problem. And the only way that that's going to shift is if men are right in the centre of this, right in the middle of it, joining in the conversation, because at the end of the day, we benefit as well. We end up as better partners. We end up as better men. We end up as better humans.
And Vic, what are your thoughts about sort of, I guess, different age groups and how we might start to break down some of the barriers in understanding of consent?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one of the things that stands out to me in it is that I actually remember in New South Wales when the law changed around marital consent. I was a young person at the time, but I remember sort of some of the education that went on around that and talking to my parents about it, and my grandfather in particular. And my grandfather saying, you know, it's interesting because in that space, there are actually men who don't believe that they get implied consent through marriage. There are actually people who are champions of the idea of every single time, all the time, actively, throughout any engagement, consent is important. So I think part of it for those folk are actually ambassadors and champions, you know, making it normal to talk about the idea that consent is actually a really good thing, you know, that the ability to give and not give consent makes you a better person and a better partner. You know, one of the things that stood out to me in some of the conversations that I've been reading around what cisgendered men who date trans men want other cisgendered men to know is that for a lot of them, when they didn't show that respect to their partner, they later on regretted it, you know, and that their relationships were better when they respected their partners, when they didn't just see their partners as sexual objects, you know, when they saw their partners as humans and they were proud of their partner, you know. So if we can normalise, if we can get those conversations out there, if we can talk about it, you know, as Tiff said, in age-appropriate ways across the lifespan, having younger, you know, I love intergenerational connections. You know, young people are amazing in the conversations that they want to have about sex and consent. Let's give them opportunities to speak to older folk about that as well. You know, we can learn from each other.
And I guess, again, going to more the gender stereotypes on all of this really is that, you know, the sort of cultural myth that women as keepers of consent and men are always up for sex, and, you know, this can make dynamics and the pressure to act in those ways in relationships is pretty, I mean, it's perpetuated through social media every single day. You just scroll, you see it every single day. So how, when we've got this monster machine of social media that's perpetuating different, well, railing against this really, how do we empower people to understand and see that this is in their interests and this is about respectful relationships? How do we start to try to shift that tide?
You know, I love social media. It's such an important tool, and I think for our communities in particular, it's a really important tool because a massive issue is that mainstream media doesn't represent us. You know? And part of the problem for that is that what we see in mainstream media sometimes is these really, problematic gender norms around relationships. I remember growing up with Degrassi High, the first iteration of it, where some of these, really problematic conversations around sex and consent and relationships were perpetuated. And that was my introduction to the world of masculinity and masculine relationships in my high school years. And there was no other representation. There was no representation of butch people on TV having really healthy, happy sexual relationships. In fact, it was the opposite. When we did see butch people on TV, it was, sexually aggressive. It was the relationship would fall apart. They'd end up in jail or dead. All of these things. So it was really problematic. Social media actually gives an outlet for our communities to see ourselves represented. And so when we can actually influence the discourse that says, actually, here is a really healthy relationship. I've started being fed a guy who watches some of these sort of far-right videos and goes, hey, here's a thought, and he challenges them. And I'm like, this is actually amazing. We need to be boosting that rather than saying social media is the issue and let's not engage it. Let's find out ways to boost the really positive messages and the messages of masculine people challenging masculine ideas. Yeah.
And oh yes, go to.
And I would add to what Vic has said and say, does mainstream media even reflect many of us with the myths that are in Hollywood movies, in music, of it's the man who has to pursue and the woman can't be a sexual entity at all and have her own wants. I feel like, it's problematic. Media is problematic on every level.
I guess with the dating apps, for example, they are quite transactional, and I think the world has shifted from meeting people in everyday context and reading people's emotions and getting that feel for someone and where they're heading with things. Do you think that these dating apps are contributing in the sort of transactional style of that type of interaction are perpetuating this issue of non-consent?
I feel like so long as you're coming back to the communication, you can still be seeking that affirmative consent no matter how short or long the relationship. So yes, you can still have a transactional one-night stand, whatever it is, but so long as you're having those conversations, you're seeking the consent, it doesn't have to be complicated, and you're having that conversation, then you can still be complying with affirmative consent.
Josh, do you have thoughts on how the sort of dating world has shifted and changed and potentially, a more transactional style of interaction, at least to begin with?
Yeah, well, because it doesn't put communication at the centre of it either. It does become that very transactional thing, and I think then we stick to those very gendered norms of male and female, and we turn up, we hook up, and that's it. And I think this is part of the kind of how do we get back to this idea that communication is really important and that we all need to be better at it, and that in order to create a better culture, we all have to be part of it. Men have to be part of that conversation. We have to be right in the middle of it. I think about we do this activity in the group we run, and we have Pat and Pat, and so we send out half the men with Pat the female, and they know, but the other half go out with Pat the male, and they get asked the same 5 questions. And so the scenario of Pat is that Pat is someone who, they're young, they love to go out, they love to party, and they really enjoy sex. They have a lot of one-night stands, and they end up with an STI. Mm-hmm. And then we say to the men, we ask these questions of them, tell us about what you think about Pat the man and what you think about Pat the female. And you can imagine what comes back. So Pat the female comes back with all of those words that you can imagine. And then, Pat the male, he's a stud, he's a player, he's all of these things. But then when you place those 2 Pats beside each other, That's where the discomfort comes in. And that's actually the space that we need men to sit in. We need them to understand that actually there is nothing comfortable about this, but we need to be better at it.
When I was developing the legislation, there was lots of discussion. It's sort of relevant to a coercive control discussion at the moment around whether you do the education first and then you do the law change, or, you know, what comes first, chicken and the egg type of thing. And I mean, my argument with the consent legislation is you can do all the education in the world, but if it's not backed up by legislation, well, then it sort of doesn't mean anything. But I do think both go hand in hand. Do you think, from your experiences in the services that you run, has there been a change in terms of understandings or experiences of people when they come to you, in terms of, has the law changed anything on the ground for the people you work with?
I think from our perspective, I feel like so we work closely with victim survivors, so I probably can't speak from the perpetrator side of things, but from the victim survivor side of things, I feel like the affirmative consent laws have shone a spotlight on what is expected and what is legal. So from my perspective, yes. However, I still feel like there's a long way to go. We are still seeing so many people every day. So until I can close my service, there is still a lot of work that we all need to do in terms of that cultural shift.
I agree with Tiff. I'd be out of a job. I wouldn't be working if we were. And unfortunately, we are inundated with men. And in many ways, that's a good thing. You know, there are men who are putting their hands up and saying, actually, I do need to be better. But I think the day that we don't is the day that we're a much, much better society.
I think from our end, one of the things that we felt is almost like a joyful willingness to engage in the conversation. You know, more and more our team are willing and able to have these conversations around our experiences, you know, as a lived experience, or, you know, the experiences that my team have, the experience that our communities have, to do the work with partner organisations, you know, working with Meridian on the development of the Messy website, you know, where we were able to talk about sex in a really positive way for our community and what consent looked like, to draw on the learnings that we have from other communities, BDSM communities, as an example around what does consent look like in all sorts of relationships and how can consent be fun. You know, it's been really actually enlivening to be having these conversations with community. You know, concerns around, well, hang on, what if I don't want people to know about my trans experience? Does that mean I haven't given, you know, all the information that they need to have consent? You know, this is a question that's come up, and the answer is no, you don't have to disclose, you know, your trans experience under affirmative consent. But you do need to check that the sexual engagement is wanted and is desirable and is fun and everyone's involved. And, you know, so having these really beautiful, nuanced conversations around what consent looks like is actually really empowering, I think, for our community.
Well, we're just running to the end of the time now, and I really hope that this discussion has, you know, sparked a lot of questions, and everyone will be here to ask questions. And thank you very much for your time today and for having this discussion. And I hope that everyone goes home and continues to have the discussions with people at home, who then go out and have more discussions with others in their lives, and we keep the conversation going. And I think if anyone here has any great ideas about how we can keep the conversation going and keep speaking, you know, to the community about what consent is, any innovative or creative ways, we're always open to that. But thank you very much for coming today.